So my new title is Psychoanalysis as the Challenge to Materialism. The challenge of psychoanalysis to materialism. I wanted to start then with a reflection on questions raised by the conference title, For a Materialist Psychoanalysis. That is, on the relations between something one might call materialism, a philosophical category open to various meanings, and psychoanalysis, a theoretical tradition that itself speaks of many voices. The title might be heard as implying that a materialist psychoanalysis is a minority, controversial, or embattled position, or even one that has yet to arrive, yet to be properly formulated. However, isn't psychoanalysis, certainly as Freud established it, always already materialist? Freud's understanding of psychoanalysis as materialist is reasonably clear, if also put into question by the problems and discoveries he encountered in the course of establishing psychoanalysis as a distinctive conceptual field. Of course, in current academic discourse, the adjective materialist and its associated noun often seems to function as an abbreviated code word, eliding those embarrassing adjectives historical and dialectical, a code word for a Marxism that dare not speak its name, or even more, a post-Marxism that retains in attenuated form some notion of social practice or social relations that is often little more than the theory of subject positioning under the rubric of a theory of discourse. If the question is then that of a relation between psychoanalysis and Marxism, then mightn't the terms of the title be reversed? Instead of for a materialist psychoanalysis, why not for a psychoanalytic materialism or psychoanalytic Marxism? How would such an hypothetical formation be different from materialist psychoanalysis in any one of its possible meanings? And would it be any more desirable? My problem with either formulation is that it obscures the unique relation of a science, a human science, to its specific object. Psychoanalysis and its constellation of concepts and clinical practices is no more constituted to give an account of the history of societies, their modes of production, class conflicts and revolutionary transformations than Marxism is to give an account of human psychic structure, psychosexuality, the unconscious, and its various pathologies. However, both traditions are, in their different ways, concerned with understandings of human time, and this is central to the processes of formation by which their specific objects of analysis come into being and endure. Furthermore, the insights into the forms of temporality peculiar to each science are intimately connected to the ways they understand the materiality of their respective objects and themselves as materialisms. Intimately connected, and I will argue from the very beginning of each science, these insights are continually put at risk by the ways in which that claim to being a materialism is conceived. The Marxist philosopher Roy Bhaskar has given us a useful discrimination of materialisms. He distinguishes between, one, a general philosophical materialism with its ontological and epistemological subsets. Two, historical materialism with its specific theses about the role of the production and reproduction of human life as the driver of human history, with explanatory power over the development and transformation of human societies. And three, dialectical materialism as a specific philosophical tradition originating with Engels' Dialectics of Nature that generalized the three dialectical laws to both the natural and the social sciences. These all share the general ontological claim that social being, with its realm of ideas, is unilaterally dependent on biological and more generally physical being and emergent from it. This ontological materialism is twinned with an epistemological materialism that distinguishes, in Bhaskar's terms, between transitive and intransitive objects of knowledge, a distinction that secures the independence of the object from the activity of concept production by which that knowledge of the object is sought. The various versions of philosophical materialism have established their identity through long millennial struggles with their opposite, idealism. If ideas are not material, if the material is the driving force or grounding reality of the immaterial ideal realm, what is to count as matter? Is the philosophical category of the material the same as the later scientific categories of the physical, whether organic or non-organic? Mary Midgley has recently argued that the category of the material or of matter is one of the most unsatisfactorily defined or specified of philosophical categories. And indeed, one thinks of the activities of contemporary theoretical physics with its black holes and dark matter and string theory and multiverses, etc., the anchor term of matter or the material suddenly has become rather destabilized and without the properties that traditional materialism has, as it were, relied on to have it there as its anchoring term. Marxist intervention in these debates constitutes what Pascal calls practical or transformative materialism. In the thesis on Feuerbach of 1845, Marx's opening blow in Thesis 1 is directed at, quote, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism, Feuerbach included, a defective conception of sensible reality as merely the object of observation or contemplation, and not as, quote, sensory human activity, practice from the position of the subject. Whereas in contradistinction from materialism, the active side was developed by idealism, unquote, although an activity only in thought. As a materialist, Feuerbach insists on objects independent of thought, but fails to conceive of, quote, human activity as objective activity. For Marx, the material is not to be conceived just as an independent reality, the object of perceiving subjects, who are themselves in turn the dependent and derivative products of external circumstances, but to be conceived as praxis, a productive and transformative action in a non-reality, an objective force in the world. In Thesis 2, Marx rejects a one-sided materialist project of changing human nature by changing the formative circumstances of human upbringing and education, which, he says, quote, divides society into two parts, one of which is superior to society. He clearly has in mind here Enlightenment projects such as figured in Rousseau's Émile, with its educational experiment in creating a natural child free of the artificial taints of sophisticated society. Marx insists instead on the dialectical coincidence of, quote, the changing of circumstances and human activity, or self-changing, to be understood as revolutionary practice. Pascal strikingly suggests that Marx's praxis materialism entails, quote, that human is distinguished from merely animal being or activity by a double freedom, a freedom from instinctual determination and a freedom to produce in a planned, premeditated way, unquote. And I'll return to this proposition towards the end of my paper. In the general claim of ontological materialism, there is a twofold thesis of dependency and emergence between social being and physical and biological reality. Depending on how these relations are conceived, there can result a methodological reductionism in which emergent levels of existence can only be properly explained in terms of their necessary material conditions on which they are dependent. Causal explanations must be posed in terms of an analytical regression to elements and processes at the level of the prior conditions that are considered to be both necessary and sufficient. And that's the crucial bit, necessary and sufficient. This reductionism begs the question as to whether the phenomena to be explained are to be considered as non-material, epiphenomenal, less real than their causes, query. Here, the arrow of causality goes one way, from material physical causes to immaterial epiphenomenal effects. Such reductionism seems in so many cases to be obviously logically deficient. For example, the way a word functions in a sentence depends on but cannot be adequately explained by the letters of which it is composed or the phonemic code of the language in which it functions. Equally, a complex literary text depends on but cannot be adequately explained by the syntactical and grammatical systems of the language it is written in. Despite the obvious problems of such reductionism, it is the prevalent paradigm in so much contemporary psychiatry, where mental states and processes are conceived as having directly physical causes, and where pathological symptoms and conditions can only be treated at that level, usually through drug therapies. There are strong and weak versions of this epiphenomenalism, where the stronger version allows no causal or determining power to mental entities at all, while the weaker version allows them to have causal impacts and effects on other mental entities, but not on physical, i.e. properly material, entities. The alternative is some form of emergent powers model that enables one to think the originating and causal powers of emergent, materially dependent entities and processes, that are not reducible to the material conditions of existence with which they necessarily coincide. This model would include both social being with its organised social practices and the social relations within and between those social practices, but also what Freud calls psychical life and the formation of its seelischer Apparat, i.e. the psychical apparatus of the soul, as he called it. Freud had, of course, begun his scientific career precisely under the influence of such a principled methodological reductionism, proclaimed in the biophysics program of the Berlin Physical Society, founded by Warwick von Helmholtz and Ernst Brucker. Freud worked for 6 years in Brucker's physiology laboratory, working on neuroanatomical projects, and then in the Vienna General Hospital under Theodor Maynard, a leading representative in Vienna of the biophysics program and a professor of psychiatry at the University of Vienna. In the introduction to his unpublished Project for Scientific Psychology of 1895, Freud announces his commitment to this biophysicalist and reductionist program. I quote the opening sentences. The intention is to furnish a psychology that shall be a natural science, that is, to represent psychical processes as quantitatively determinate states of specifiable particles. Quantitatively determinate states of specifiable particles, unquote. The two fundamental elements of this supposedly psychological system are first of all neurons, the basic units or cells of the nervous system, which are, quote, to be taken as material particles. And secondly, quanta of nervous energy, Qn, which are nevertheless governed by the general laws of motion that govern the circulation of all physical energy. The latter is conceived as taking two forms, a mobile quantity in flow that passes through a sequence or chain of neurons, and then bound energy that, under certain circumstances, invests a specific neuron. The passage of quanta of excitation through the neuronic system is regulated by the principle of neuronic inertia, which Freud calls his first principle theorem. Quote, the neurons tend to divest themselves of quantity. Reflex movement is now intelligible as the established form of this giving off. The principle of neuronic inertia provides the motive for reflex movement. This discharge represents the primary function of the nervous system, unquote. What is curious about this postulation of the so-called nervous system is that it is not a biological model of a living organism at all, but a mechanical model governed by the logic of the reflex arc, which, in the words of Laplanche and Pontalis, is seen as, quote, transmitting the energy it receives in its entirety, unquote, and which, as Laplanche points out, is a nonsense physically. Freud reaffirms it again as late as the interpretation of dreams and the abstract model of perception and the memory systems proposed in the much discussed schema in Chapter 7. Quote, the psychical apparatus must be constructed like a reflex apparatus. Reflex processes remain the model of every psychical function, unquote. It returns finally in 1920 in Beyond the Pleasure Principle as a model of the death instinct, transposed from the physics of mechanical systems, not just to the level of human psychical functioning, but implausibly to all organic life. However, by the time Freud was writing the draft of the project, the biophysics program in which psychical events were the side effects of reflex action had been abandoned as a failure by its founders, and Freud's mentors in Vienna, Brucker and Maynard, had, as well as the leading figure von Helmholtz, had moved to the psychophysics program associated with the work of Gustav Fechner. Freud adapted from Fechner his version of the principle of constancy and the associated pleasure principle, although in fact it deviates widely from Fechner's own. I demonstrate that in some length in a chapter on the death instinct in my recent book on Freud and trauma. Here, instead of the physics of mechanical energy, it is a question of the vital order and its conditions of existence, especially the homeostasis necessary for all living organisms, and along with the theory of inherited instincts and their feedback loops to maintain homeostasis. These provide models for Freud as he attempts to think the specificity of psychical life and its functioning as an emergent order that depends on the biological organism from which it is thought to emerge. So instead of a mechanical materialism, we then have a biomaterialism. The two fundamental topographical figures in Freud's thought are that of the mechanical system open to inputs from the environment and characterized by a reflex action of discharge, and that of a closed homeostatic system that seeks to maintain an optimum energy level for survival and functioning in a threatening environment, as in the famous model of the vesicle in Chapter 4 of Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Both of them are regulated by opposed logics or principles, and an essential problem at the heart of Freudian thought is how they are to be articulated in a coherent picture of the workings of neither a mechanical nor a biological system, but what Freud calls the psychical apparatus. It is only in a later moment of theoretical construction that Freud invokes what he calls a secondary function imposed by the exigencies of life, unquote. This involves the accumulation of a store of energy that would enable this strange self-evacuating nervous system that he posits to perform specific actions that would meet the satisfaction of the major needs: hunger, respiration, sexuality. In other words, quote, the nervous system is obliged to abandon its initial trend to inertia and to zero. The trend persists, however, in modified form as an endeavour, at least to keep the quantity of nervous energy as low as possible and to guard against any increase of it, that is, to keep it constant, unquote. The result is the principle of constancy that regulates the second topographical figure of the closed homeostatic system and seeks to maintain an optimum level for functioning is subordinated to the first principle. Furthermore, it is described as a reluctant modification of its opposite, the zero principle of discharge, as if they were variant expressions of the same logic rather than two opposed logics. Jean Laplanche has made a trenchant critique of these founding assumptions of Freud's that initiate his project for scientific psychology and which remain foundational through to his last texts. Pointing to the assignment of a primary function to the model of a free circulation and discharge of energy, Laplanche observes, quote, at the beginning we are given a description of an organism which would be, as yet, non-living. Constancy of level and homeostasis, although they characterise the vital function itself, would thus be introduced only secondarily into what should have been, supposedly from the beginning, an organism, unquote. This is part of Laplanche's critique of a model Freud takes from Hewlings-Jackson, sometimes called the father of British neurology, of a neurological hierarchy of brain functions from the primitive and simplest, integrated under the control of the more complex higher centres, and of a possible entropy or regression down the scale. In particular, Laplanche targets the notion of the primary in Freud's thought, which for Freud comes to include a coalescence of various regressions. First, the topographical regression to the unconscious as a separate psychical system with its own laws of functioning. Second, the formal regression from the conceptual to the sensory and perceptual, as in dreams. And thirdly, the temporal regression to older, infantile and primitive psychical structures, ultimately to a time before the organic, even in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Laplanche argues that Freud's description of an abstract circulation and discharge model of functioning would be primary cannot be taken as a biological first stage. Quote, it is biologically unthinkable that the living being could pass through a first stage in which it was a mechanical system open to all the winds, seeking nothing but to empty itself completely of its energy, unquote. Instead, its value, Laplanche argues, is as a description of a secondary process that only becomes, topographically and formally, primary. Quote, it is rightly to be interpreted as a model not of the living being, but of the process occurring in a preliminary living being from the moment when an unconscious comes to exist. I repeat that. It is rightly to be interpreted as a model not of the living being, but of the process occurring in a preliminary living being from the moment when an unconscious comes to exist, unquote. Laplanche's reversal of Freud's so-called primary and secondary functions, in which the circulation and discharge model figures instead as a secondary formation of the unconscious within an already constituted living being, can indeed find some support, paradoxically, from Freud's own text. It is certainly true that the project's programmatic opening announces bravely a natural science, as we saw in the reductionist rhetoric of the biophysics program of Brucker and Helmholtz. Freud admits, however, that what he calls his first principle theorem is in fact derived from, quote, pathological clinical observation of hysteria and obsessions and their excessively intense ideas. In particular, it was processes such as stimulus, substitution, conversion and discharge, that is, the unconscious psychical processes at work in the formation of symptoms and dreams, which directly suggested the conception of neuronal excitation as quantity in a state of flow, unquote. So instead of neurons as material particles in a quantitatively determinate state, it is mental entities, excessively intense ideas, unquote, and the psychical energy that traverses and invests them, which are actually thought as a form of psychical physics. This is a psychophysics that describes not the natural state of conscious mental life, but instead the alienated effects of the defensive processes of repression that constitute the repressed unconscious as a separate mental system. What is implicitly at stake here is the question as to whether the unconscious and its specific forms of functioning, the so-called primary processes of condensation and displacement, etc., are there from the beginning and so primordial, as in the id of the second topography of 1923, or rather are instead the byproducts of the ego's defensive and binding strategies of repression and sublimation, as in the repressed unconscious system of the papers on metapsychology from 1915. Those two conceptions, the unconscious, leapfrog each other and fight it out through Freud's texts. Freud's gradual formulation of the unconscious as a specific mental system with its own modes of functioning takes place, as we know, in the context of his encounter with hysteria in 1885-86 in the clinic of the great neurologist Jean-Martin Charcot at the Hospital of La Salpêtrière in Paris, with its huge population of 5,000 resident incurables. Using his anatomo-clinical method, Charcot had established a series of correlations between symptomatic disease pictures clinically encountered at the bedside of his long-stay patients and the lesions of specific sections of spinal cord and its fibres connecting to the cortex or the peripheral organs discovered by dissection in the post-mortem room. He thus established the localization of different bodily functions and identifiable disease entities in specific areas of the brain and nervous system. To his initially triumphalist vision of the new neurology, hysteria and other psychoneuroses posed a challenge, quote, evidently having their seat in the nervous system, but which leave in the dead body no material trace. These symptomatic combinations, deprived of anatomical substratum, lack the appearance of solidity and objectivity, and come before us like so many sphinx, Charcot declared. So a challenge to the assumptions, then, of both a mechanical and a biomaterialism. The enigma of hysteria for Charcot can be summed up in two terms, idiogenesis and neuromimesis. Charcot cited as seminal for his own work in 1869 seminal for his own work, an 1869 paper of J. Russell Reynolds, which he had heard as a lecture before the British Medical Association in London that year. This argued that, quote, some of the most serious disorders of the nervous system, such as paralysis, spasm, pain, and otherwise altered sensations, may depend upon a morbid condition of emotion, of idea and emotion, or of ideas alone. That they have the appearance also of complicated diseases of the brain or spinal cord. Consequently, in their case, it is important to distinguish between the effects of organic lesions as distinct from those of morbid ideation. In this strange phenomenon of idiogenesis, causality here is attributed to morbid ideas and emotions, not to organic lesions. And stranger still, its symptoms are identical with those of certain recognized syndromes that do have organic causes. So we have the genesis of bodily symptoms by ideas and feelings, excessively intense ideas, and which imitate existing organic conditions that the patients have no knowledge of. Sir James Paget called this phenomenon nervous mimicry or neuromimesis, the title of a collection of his lectures cited by Charcot, and Paget considered them as an objective dysfunctioning of the nervous system. In his transitional paper of 1893, comparing organic paralyses with hysterical paralyses, in which he exits distinctively from neurology into a psychology, Freud proposed a meticulous and systematic description of the different sets of nerve fibres, those linking the spinal cord to the peripheries, hands and feet, and those linking the spinal cord to the cerebral cortex. The peripherospinal and the spinal cortical nerve systems that determine the two different kinds of organic paralysis. It's a very complex paper, and I work through it in considerable detail in my Freud book. Freud then charts how hysterical paralyses mix some but not all of the incompatible features of these two kinds of organic paralysis in a way that contradicts the anatomical patterns of causality he's just so meticulously described. Freud points also to the so-called glove and stocking pattern of hysterical paralyses, in which, as he put it, quote, "The leg is the leg as far up as its insertion into the hip. The arm is the upper limb, insofar as it is visible under the clothing," unquote. These do not correspond, of course, to any distinct segments of the nervous fibres themselves. Consequently, Freud argues that it is to the ideas and conceptions of the organs in their ordinary popular sense of the names they bear, and not precise anatomical localization in the nervous system, that we must turn to the determinants of hysterical paralysis. This leads him to propose that, quote, "the lesion in hysterical paralyses must be completely independent of the anatomy of the nervous system, since hysteria behaves as if anatomy does not exist, or as though it has no knowledge of it." Hysteria behaves as if anatomy does not exist, or as though it has no knowledge of it. Which is an extraordinary conclusion for a neurologist to come to. Charcot had proposed a functional lesion that he had initially supposed would be located in the same organ as its anatomical twin, but which he was never able to localize. Freud redefines this functional lesion as a functional alteration in the excitability and accessibility of the affected organ at the level of, quote, "our tactile and visual perceptions of the body," unquote. If this mental representation, charged with affect, is unable to be discharged because it is unconscious and outside the control of the ego, then, quote, "the memory of the impression attains the importance of a trauma and becomes the cause of permanent hysterical symptoms," unquote. This transitional text of 1893 is, to borrow the terminology of Louis Althusser and Gaston Bachelard, used by the former in his analysis of the transitional ruptures in the thought of Marx. It is the site of a coupure epistémologique, an epistemological break between two distinct theoretical problematics or fields. As James Strachey, Freud's translator, points out in his editorial introduction in the Standard Edition, the 1893 paper on paralyses consists of 4 parts, of which the first 3 were finished by August 1888, after which a 5-year silence ensued before the final 4th part was completed and published in the year of Charcot's death. The first 3 parts are a summa of all that the anatomo-clinical method can tell us of the anatomical and functional differences between the two kinds of organic paralysis. And they end with a consideration of the aporia in Charcot's neurology of hysteria, the postulation of a dynamic or functional lesion for which no appreciable tissue changes can be found post-mortem. The delayed 4th part offers a solution to this aporia by transposing it onto the grounds of a psychical trauma and its effects. Split 3/4 of the way through by its 5-year suspension, its interrupted textual formation indicates that this is preeminently a transitional text, a text of the break. Freud made his exit then from neurology into a psychological field in which psychic representations under certain specifiable conditions are the residuary deposits of traumatic intensities, carriers of affect that have acquired the dignity of psychic causes and that act not just epiphenomenally on the other mental representations, but act back on the body and its functions. In a lecture given in the same year, Freud locates the affective power of certain mental representations in the experience of a trauma that has been banished from consciousness, but whose after effects inform a prototypical range of bodily symptoms. When this traumatic experience has been accessed, initially under hypnosis and later through free association, in the form of an affective acting out of a perceptually vivid memory dominated by affect, Freud writes, quote, "If we compel the patient to put this affect into words, we shall find that at the same time as he is producing the violent affect, the phenomenon of his pains emerges very markedly once again, and that thenceforth the symptom, in its chronic character, disappears, unquote. In the studies on hysteria 2 years later, both Breuer and Freud report the same phenomenon. For example, Freud writes of Elizabeth von R, quote, "Her painful legs began to join in the conversation during our analyses. If by a question I called up a memory, a sensation of pain would make its first appearance. And this was usually so sharp that the patient would give a start and put her hand to the painful spot. The pain that was thus aroused would persist so long as she was under the influence of the memory. It would reach its climax when she was in the act of telling me the essential and decisive part of what she had to communicate. And with the last word of this, it would disappear," unquote. This release of what Freud calls strangulated affect through the power of speech, with the accompanying intensification of the bodily symptoms, deprives the excessively intense ideas of their power to paralyze or derange the body's functions. The arrow of causality now goes in reverse, as Freud feels his way from a biomaterialism to what one might call a psychomaterialism, though increasingly the reference back to the anchoring term matter seems less and less pertinent. As Freud develops his understanding of psychic trauma, what I have called the arrow of causality turns out to have a temporal dimension. The simple linear model in which the time of the cause is succeeded by the time of its effects is thrown into reverse. Freud's differentiation of psychical trauma from physical trauma, along with the action of the psychical back on the vital order itself, reveals also the action of the present back onto the past and its residues. Freud invents a neologism to capture this temporal reversal, Nachträglichkeit, which we should place along with idiogenesis as phenomena that throw the standard causal sequences of traditional materialism into question. In the standard edition, Strachey translates this term as deferred action. This has the major disadvantage of reducing its temporal complexity to the forward linear dimension of postponement or deferral that was its chief merit to challenge. Freud created an abstract noun out of the adjective adverb nachträglich, meaning later, belated, afterwards. Derived from the German preposition nach, after, and the verb tragen, to carry, it could be translated into English literally as carrying afterness. The verb nachtragen can mean to carry a grudge or a grievance against someone. Laplanche has suggested the English neologism afterwardsness, or alternatively, perhaps we could just say afterness. Strachey's translation, deferred action, is analogous to Freud's early notion of abreaction, both of which imply the discharge of affect sometime after an event. In the case of abreaction, a neologism invented by Breuer and Freud in their 93 paper Preliminary Communications, it was a discharge of what Freud called strangulated affect that had been in some way blocked, whose blockage had produced hysterical symptoms and required purging, or what he also called catharsis. He saw it as analogous with the process of incubation that Charcot had described as characteristic of the delayed after effects of the shock experienced by accident victims. They may have sustained only minor injuries or even walked away from the train derailment or workplace accident apparently unharmed, only some weeks later to develop a paralysis or physical dysfunction on the part of the body involved in the accident. It led Charcot to propose what he called hypnoid states as a result of the shock experience and the consequent mental dissociation that allowed unconscious ideas, memories of the event, to disable the functioning of bodily organs that had sustained no histological damage. In opposition to the Berlin School and indeed Paget, Charcot had assimilated this idiogenesis of these traumatic after effects to the category of hysteria. Breuer and Freud's preliminary communication, while acknowledging Charcot and claiming to follow in his footsteps, it had in fact made the opposite move to Charcot, shifting the causal paradigm inherited from Charcot by subsuming the whole symptomatic field of the hysterias under the reign of a generalized traumatic causality. Reading through the studies on hysteria of 1895, one can trace the increasing complication of what had begun as a simple cause-effect model of how psychic traumas operated. The aim initially was to trace back the symptom to its first moment of appearance, on the assumption that this would be an originary moment that revealed its ultimate cause. As to working through the memories and associated affects of that moment often produced a therapeutic liquidation of the symptom, its joining in the conversation and subsequent fading was at first taken by Freud as the guarantor of its identity with the underlying trauma. However, Freud soon came to recognise, as he admits at the end of the preliminary communications paper, quote, "We do not cure hysteria insofar as it is a matter of disposition. Our procedure cannot prevent the phenomena which have been so laboriously removed from being at once replaced by new ones. This has brought us nearer to an understanding only of the mechanism of hysterical symptoms and not of their internal causes," unquote. For Charcot, this underlying predisposition was an inherited hysterical constitution, and the traumatic experiences involved were merely accidental causes that activated that constitution. His metaphor for them was that of the agent provocateur, whose role was merely to trigger the pre-existing hysteria into operation and then vanish away. For Freud, Charcot's inherited hysterical constitution was something he quickly came to marginalise as merely a supplementary force and then finally to reject entirely. He moved the experience of trauma centre stage and the different kinds of defence it provoked from the besieged and overwhelmed ego. However, his clinical experience led him, against expectation, further and further back into his patient's infantile prehistory as it became clearer that the moment of the symptoms' first appearance did not exhaust or even explain the specific characteristics of the symptom. There was often a disproportionate intensity in the patient's response to the situation in which the symptom first appeared, which again and again pointed back to further scenes and emotional dramas already in place that needed to be accessed. The classic case is that of Emma, presented in part 2 of the unpublished project of 1895 that dealt with psychopathology and in particular with hysterical defence. This presentation formalises what had become increasingly recognised in the later case studies, in studies on hysteria, of Katharina, Elizabeth von R, and especially Miss Lucy R, as distinct from a physical trauma that overwhelms the subject with an unmanageable force in a single moment of impact and that breaches the organism's boundaries and defences. A psychical trauma has a crucial temporal dimension, which is not just that of incubation or postponed discharge. Behind the most recent remembered events that Freud labelled auxiliary, for example, Katharina's hysterical attack when looking through her cousin's bedroom window at an obscure sight she couldn't describe, or Lucy R's persecution by a succession of smells of burning, of pudding on the stove, or of a gentleman's cigar, long after the events that they referenced, or Emma's long-term phobic inability to go into shops alone after a sudden flight from a department store when 2 young male assistants seemed to be laughing at her clothes, and one of whom, we are told, quote, pleased her sexually. Behind these auxiliary scenes, there lay hidden 1 or 2 more earlier scenes, and finally the actual traumatic scene, which was hidden from the conscious remembering ego, and which Freud was later to call a primal scene, though that phrase is, I argue, systematically misunderstood by psychoanalysts since Freud, and is not simply a reference to a particular content, i.e. The scene of parental intercourse, but it plays its part in a certain model of traumatic temporality. Freud is to encounter again and again this strange clinical phenomenon of what I would call a scenic palimpsest, with one scene layered upon and active within another in a series of visual, auditory and configurational rhymes that demand from him the elaboration of a scenography of trauma. In the case of Emma, she herself traced her phobia back to the scene in the department store at the age of 12, after puberty we are told, none of the details of which explain, however, her initial fright and even less her permanent phobia. The sequence of key scenic elements here goes shop assistants, laughing, clothes, sexual release, fright, flight, phobia. That's the scene she thinks her way back to, remembers her way back to, when asked, when did this fear or phobia first begin? In the course of the analysis, she came to recover a second memory, or a second pair of memories, that she had not been conscious of at the time of the first scene mentioned, of going into a shop to buy sweets at the age of about 8, and where her genitals were groped through her clothes by the grinning shopkeeper. She'd gone there a second time and now reproached herself for doing so and had developed a state of oppressive bad conscience. The phrase is in inverted commas in Freud's text, and so it is implied the words are Emma's own. Emma herself pointed out the link between the two scenes, the laughing of the assistants and the grin of the shopkeeper. The later scene, Freud suggests, aroused unconsciously the memory of the earlier one. He also adds the rhyme between the two scenes. She is once again in the shop alone with a man. The puzzling traumatic force and resultant phobia of the later scene can only be understood by interpolating the elements of the earlier scene that runs parallel to them. Because the scene of the symptoms' belated Nachtraeglich emergence is not able to explain the symptom. The scenic elements of the earlier scene go shopkeeper, grinning, assault, clothes, return visit, bad conscience. The key difference between the two scenes for Freud is that by the later one she had reached puberty. Hence he draws the conclusion that, quote, the memory aroused what it certainly was not able to do at the time, a sexual release, which was transformed into anxiety. With this anxiety, she was afraid that the shop assistants might repeat the assault, and she ran away. A fear of being in a shop alone with the male assistants, the outcome of flight from the danger of assault with its reparatory reversal of her second visit to the shopkeeper, about which she felt so guilty, are, Freud comments, rationally constructed, except that the only element from the earlier scene that entered consciousness was the clothes. Consequently, Emma constructed a series of false connections between the puzzling elements of the later scene, rather like the tidied up secondary vision of a dream. That the assistants must have been laughing at her clothes, and it was one of them that aroused in her an excitation. Through a process of displacement, the scene of assault is replaced by the apparently innocuous but overdetermined element of the clothes. The clothes act as a bridge between the two parallel situations of being in a shop alone with the grinning shopkeeper and being in a store with the laughing shop assistants, transferring the significance of the first situation, whose memory is only now repressed, to the second. Freud argues that the process of repression accompanied by pathological symbol formation, the close of a condensed symbol of the now repressed early scene, is provoked by the deferred but intensified sexual release made possible by the advent of puberty. He asserts that the sexual release was not part of the child's experience of the original assault. Hence we have the paradox of, quote, a memory arousing an affect which it did not arouse as an experience, because puberty had made possible a different understanding of what was remembered, a different translation. This is the psychical constellation peculiar to sexual life that Freud invokes and that determines the nature of hysterical repression. Quote, a memory is repressed which has become a trauma by, in Strachey's phrase, by deferred action, or afterwardsness. Deferred action is Strachey's translation, as I've said, in this case of the noun form in the as a noun form in the standard edition of what is in fact an adjective adverb, Nachtraeglich, in Freud's text. Its inadequacy is clear from its suggestion of a merely forward linear progression and postponement, as in the old idea of abreaction, whereas the logic of Freud's argument entails, instead, a belated precipitation of the sexual affect and meaning of a primary scene by the retrospective interpretation and, quote, different understanding of what was remembered, plus the intensified response to it provoked by the action back on the unassimilated elements of the earlier scene by the rhyming elements of the later scene. While Freud claims that, as with the case of Katharina, this is typical of repression in hysteria, he also generalizes, interestingly, this logic of deferral and retroaction by claiming that, quote, every adolescent individual has memory traces which can only be understood with the emergence of sexual feelings of his own, unquote. Hence, everyone carries the germ of hysteria. He is clearly, in this case, still operating with, as it were, a traditional notion that sexuality is something that begins at puberty. On the other hand, he keeps encountering clinical evidence that points in the opposite direction, and he's struggling in some ways to understand that. The temporality of trauma here involves a dialectic of belatedness and retroaction that takes place between at least two moments. In other words, it requires two moments and the time lag between them to produce a psychical trauma. an original inscription that was both enigmatic and excessive, and hence remains unintegrated, excluded in a limbo of the preconscious, is both reactivated and translated into the terms of the later moment, producing in that second moment both the deferred and transferred sexual release from the grinning shopkeeper to the attractively laughing assistant, plus the blockage and repression of the memory and the defensive symptom of flight and the resultant permanent phobia about going into shops alone. Freud restates the essential anomaly of his conception of traumatic temporality in the seduction theory papers that follow in 1896, although it is put at risk there by his search for a single causal scene. In his first essay on heredity, he writes, this is where he's rejecting Charcot's model of an inherited constitution, due to puberty, the memory will display a power which was completely lacking from the event itself. The memory will operate as though it were a contemporary event. What happens is, as it were, a posthumous action by a sexual trauma. The sexual trauma in question in the 1896 essays is that of an explicit sexual stimulation of the genitals in early childhood by another person, usually an adult. That's how he phrases it. Freud's insistence on this specific and uniform content, and increasingly throughout 1896 and 1897, he comes to insist on the figure of the perverse pedophilic father as the determining scene in all cases of psychopathology. This put at risk the complexity and overdetermination of the process of Nutcracker. Quote, we are not accustomed to the notion of powers emanating from a mnemic image, a memory image, which were absent from the real impression. The paradox of afterwardsness was that it was neither the immediate direct action of either infantile or later scenes that explained the symptoms, but, quote, the powers emanating from a mnemic image, an image that belonged exclusively to neither scene but derived from both. The effect of afterwardsness depended on the articulation of both scenes, or indeed whole sequences of them, and included the crucial role of defense and repression. Freud acknowledges this in passing, but then sets it aside. As a result, the necessary overdetermination of the symptom, which he describes as being called up by a combination of several factors and aroused from various directions simultaneously, this is marginalised by his drive to identify the earliest infantile scene as the sole specific cause responsible for the historical disposition. As such, Freud's traumatic X replaced Charcot's hereditary constitution. The determining power of excessively intense ideas, overdetermined with respect to their originating experiences, of unconscious memories that are relived as if for the first time and as contemporary events by patients who often insisted they did not remember them. These overturn the causal paradigm of a certain materialism with its ascending hierarchy of physical and biological causes, but merely epiphenomenal mental effects. And in doing so, it disrupts the determinist model of a linear progressive time. It was for this reason that my original intention for this paper was to compare Freud's Nutcracker and Benjamin's Jetztzeit, or now time. Benjamin's was an attempt to elaborate a critique of the social Darwinist doctrine of inevitable progress, driven by scientific and technological advances and implemented by a triumphalist capitalism. The angel of history is the witness to that, to the disastrous and catastrophic effects of what is called progress, as he puts it. In the form of a belief in the inevitability of socialism or of communism, this determinist doctrine had been adopted both by the socialist democratic parties of the Second International and even the communist parties of the Third International, with disastrous political consequences, Benjamin argues. I haven't myself the time now to explore properly Benjamin's paradoxical borrowing of the theological doctrine of the resurrection of the dead from Judeo-Christian apocalyptic thought, and his attribution of what he calls, quote, a weak messianic power to the present generation involved in social struggles in a current state of emergency and political crisis, a power to awaken the dead and redeem the lost potential of past moments of struggle and defeat for the exploited classes and groups, which would be a resource for current struggles. In particular, he calls for a critique of the assumption behind both capitalist and socialist doctrines of progress, that the inevitable historical progress of mankind would be a progression through an homogeneous, empty time. faced with the metaphor of the locomotive of history being driven onward by the heroic Stakhanovite labours of the proletariat to the inevitable goal of socialism, Benjamin turns the image on its head. Proletarian and revolutionary struggles, he suggested, were the last-minute desperate attempt by the passengers on the train to put on the brake, to get off the runaway train of capitalist development before it smashed everything in its path. Benjamin, in other words, didn't want to complete the existing moment of history or to see its logic triumphantly fulfilled. He wanted to interrupt history, not to fulfill it, to break open the continuum of historical inevitability and to allow the excluded memories and aspirations of the defeated to be heard and to energise the present. The revolution, like the Messiah, will not arrive on schedule. Quote, for every second of the time was the straight gate through which the Messiah might enter. Unquote. Benjamin doesn't give a systematic philosophical exposition of what he calls now-time, a now-time shot through with the splinters of messianic time. Rather, he sketches it through allegory, metaphor, historical anecdote, and allusion, and with surprising borrowings. He invokes Leibniz's monad, Proust's involuntary memory, Freud's traumatic shock, and the motif of the messianic. And he's doing, in a way, it occurs to me, something that's the reverse of what Freud does when he takes the reflex arc and he uses it to model what he himself admits are the primary psychical processes involved in symptom formation in the dream work. And he's doing it in the reverse. He's taking a psychological concept like Proust's involuntary memory, an account of the discontinuities of subjective lived time, or he's taking the theological concept of the messianic interruption of history in order to think a different historical logic at a collective level rather than at an individual psychical level. As I say, it would take a considerable assemblage of materials to create a context in which Benjamin's violently interrupted meditations on historical time begin to make a kind of sense. Though I find that seductive, intriguing, and also almost impossible to get my mind around in some ways. What now I can only point to is what has struck me as that uncanny, if partial, parallel between Freudian afterwardsness and Benjaminian now-time. The sense of a present moment of crisis, what Benjamin calls a state of emergency, in which different possibilities struggle to impose themselves, either the self-replication of the hitherto dominant powers that have kept the present in a kind of lockdown in either social or psychic life, as against the resurgence of lost experiences and memories of lost time, to use Proust's phrase, that has been unassimilated and marginalised from the lived experience of continuous time, but that continually knocks at the door, at the straight gate, if you like, and in which there lurks any emancipatory possibility that is to be had for the future. So I want to finish by returning to psychoanalysis and the question of time, the interrupted continuum of lived subjective time and what might interrupt it, in a word, the unconscious and the drive, and its implications for something I'm calling, with increasing skepticism, materialism. The unconscious, as Freud discovered its effects and struggled to conceptualise it, appeared first of all in the context of his model of trauma, as precisely what the ego has defended itself against, what it has excluded, and so what remains unassimilated and unprocessed. In the tightly specified model of traumatic seduction, this excess that invades, excites, but also swamps and paralyses the ego comes from the other, from what Freud called, in one of his most theoretically prescient and productive letters to Fliess, 6th of December 86, quote, the prehistoric, unforgettable other person who is unequalled by anyone later. And speaking about his own self-analysis in another letter to Fliess, he speaks of his nurse, whom he called the prime originator of both his sexual initiation and his later self-diagnosed hysteria. The results of this traumatic seduction are described by Freud in a metaphor which he opposes to Charcot's agent provocateur that merely releases the symptom. And Freud's metaphor is that of a foreign body. Quote, the psychical trauma, or more precisely the memory of the trauma, acts like a foreign body which, long after its entry, must continue to be regarded as an agent that is still at work. Freud's traumatic unconscious, with its traumatizing foreign body, as initially conceived, is thus located as the byproduct of an asymmetrical exchange between seducer and seduced. It's clear that here Freud is operating with a conception of the unconscious as pathological, temporary, and clinically reducible. Once its traumatic contents are brought to consciousness, Freud's expectation is that memory will then be restored, a reaction will take place, the unconscious will be liquidated. Freud's clinical disappointments on this score was one of his 4 objections to his own seduction theory in the famous letter to Fleece of September 1897. It prompted his temporary but recurrent rejection of his own theory. It is only with Freud's major opus devoted to a non-pathological and universal phenomenon of the dream that Freud acknowledges and begins to theorize an unconscious that is, by contrast, permanent, irreducible, and insistent, but encountered only in those epistemologically unreliable derivatives, the dream, the symptom, the screen memory, the transference. The temporary traumatic unconscious is then replaced, in Freud's thought, by two alternatives. The unconscious constructed by repression as elaborated in the metapsychological papers of 1915 and the primordial id of 1923, the latter there from the beginning as the contradictory conflation of both instincts of self-preservation and the sexual drives. The latter brings us to the question of the drive and its difference from in relation to the instinctual functions. As it is now increasingly acknowledged in the Anglosphere, Strachey's translation in the Standard Edition of Freud's 2 German terms, instinct with a K and Trieb, conflates 2 quite distinct conceptions and puts at risk the originality of the Freudian drive. Unfortunately, Freud never reflected theoretically on the distinction, and it has been up to later commentators to construct it from his not entirely consistent usage of the 2 terms. And I agree with what Miguel said. There are certain moments in Freud's text where translating Trieb as instinct seems the right thing to do. We have a problem so often with Trieb, the sexual Trieb being translated as instinct with all sorts of misleading baggage going with that word. But beyond the pleasure principle, when confronted with the death drive, which is implicit in all living matter, so it's no longer something psychical. Instinct would seem to be the appropriate term. So Freud keeps using the word Trieb at the very moment when actually he's moving a concept from the psychical into this extraordinary Lamarckian history of all organic matter. And he calls it the todestry, the death drive, rather than the death instinct. There are 3 problematics of the drive in Freud's text that are never articulated together by him. I'll list them. First, that of the spontaneous emergence from the instinctual functions via the relation of Anlehnung or leaning on, of the self-pleasuring drive, leaning on the instinctual function, and its subsequent deviation onto a series of later substitutive part objects. Secondly, there's that of the expulsion and permanent fixation of the psychical representative, the Vorstellung Repräsentanz of the drive, by the primitive reaction of anticathexis that constitutes primal repression, something that Freud later suggests is provoked by an excessive degree of excitation and the traumatic breaking through of the protective shield against stimuli. So primal repression is a response to something traumatic coming from the other. Finally, that of maternal seduction in the basic nurturing gestures of childcare, feeding, cleaning, comforting the infant. This achieves its most explicit statement in the third of the 3 essays. And I want to read out this bit because it's one of the most extraordinary moments, I think, in a Freud who has officially but not actually abandoned his trauma model. Quote, "A child's intercourse with anyone responsible for his care affords him an unending source of sexual excitation and satisfaction from his erotogenic zones. This is especially so since the person in charge of him, who after all is as a rule his mother, herself regards him with feelings that are derived from her sexual life. She strokes him, kisses him, rocks him, and quite clearly treats him as a substitute for a complete sexual object." So we have here the other and the other with an unconscious and already formed sexuality. A mother would probably be horrified if she was made aware that all her marks of affection were rousing her child's sexual drive, the word is trieb, and preparing for its later intensity. She is only fulfilling her task in teaching the child to love, unquote. Here the sexual excitations that are the byproducts of childcare are not spontaneous emergences from the instinctual functions of self-preservation that meet the organism's basic needs and are as if guaranteed by a pre-given developmental program. Instead, they are responses to the exciting and affect-laden gestures of maternal care, the marks of affection that arouse the child's sexual trieb. So central to the restricted theory of child sexual abuse and its psychopathological outcomes, but now only intermittently and fleetingly in his later developmental theory of infantile sexuality, is the figure of the prime originator, the prehistoric, unforgettable other person who was unequalled by anyone later. These phrases memorably capture what Laplanche was later to call the primacy of the adult other, when he generalized it to what he called the universal primal seduction. It is this fundamental anthropological situation of the human being with its enabling factors, the radical prematurity of the human neonate, with the associated deficiency of the inherited self-preservative instincts and functions, and the consequent primacy of the interventions of the nurturing adult to supplement that deficiency, and the dependency of the neonate on those interventions over such a long period. These all pose a further challenge to the standard biomaterialist and biodevelopmental model of determination of the psychical by material factors. At this point, I want to recall Roy Bascar's striking claim that Marxist praxis materialism entails, quote, that human is distinguished from merely animal being or activity by a double freedom, a freedom from instinctual determination and a freedom to produce in a planned, premeditated way, unquote. Bascar's argument is that the organised social practice of making, which is also a practice of self-making or transformation of the makers, opens up the possibility of a freedom from instinctual determination, characteristic of animal life. Pascal may not be thinking of psychoanalysis, but his claim is consistent with Freud's use of the German instinct with a K in relation to animal species, with their inherited programs of fixed instinctual behaviours, innate aims and objects, and his account of the trieb with its contingency and substitutability of sexual object, its vicissitudes of repression, sublimation, turning round on the subject, etc. Revealingly, when Freud poses the question as to what in human nature is the equivalent of instinct in animals, it is not the trieb he proposes, but rather his alternative conception of the phylogenetically inherited primal fantasy. And that's a whole can of worms I don't want to open at this point. The social praxis that opens up this freedom from instinctual determination and a space for the emergence of the distinctively human drive is the practice of infant nurturance and child rearing. Central to it is the psychodynamic of primal seduction, exercised by the prime originator, an adult with a repressed unconscious and an already formed sexuality, on whom the infant without either is radically dependent, not just for food, shelter, but in order to come into being as a human subject. I'm just about to finish. Implicit in various dispersed texts of Freud and systematised and invented explicit by Laplanche is the awareness that the formation of the repressed unconscious as a separate mental system and the formation of the drive are simultaneous, the recto verso of each other. The traumatic foreign body that comes from the prime originator, carried by her marks of affection, breaks through the shield against stimuli and provokes the exclusion and permanent fixation of the drive to its psychical representative, thereby, Laplanche suggests, creating the drive. Laplanche calls this the source object of the drive. It's a portmanteau term in which he binds together the two notions of the source and the object of the drive and transforms them. An external, traumatic and signifying object that has become an internal psychical source of the drive. A psychical signifying object, Laplanche suggests, that has been fragmented and reified by repression, by primal repression. As Freud says, the unconscious contains not word presentations, but thing presentations. Laplanche adds thingified, reified presentations, reduced to what he calls an alien materiality, frozen, fixed beyond any meaning that may inhabit them, beyond all potentiality, to which he accords the generative power of schemas and the materiality of quasi-things. The generative power of schemas and the materiality of quasi-things. This is Freud's das andere Psychische, the other psychical thing, a psychical entity, Laplanche says, that is as hard as iron or harder. This psychical thing in the unconscious, the system of such psychical things, that is the unconscious and that returns to fuel or treatment to push the drive impulses that infest and agitate the human organism. Although descriptively Laplanche uses the language of a kind of metaphorical or transposed materialism, just as Freud had used the language of the neurone and of the reflex arc to talk about the primary processes, or of the homeostatic, self-regulating entity as a possible model for the ego, or the ego under siege, as in the vesicle of 1920. Though Laplanche uses that kind of language to describe the psychical here, he in fact doesn't use the word materialism, but more generally to describe psychic life. Instead, he talks of a realism of the unconscious, rather than a materialism of the unconscious. Perhaps it is time to put aside the M word with its misleading anchor term, an obsolete 19th century conception of matter, which, with its reductionist baggage, locked into an ancient binary opposition of materialism and idealism, matter versus ideas. Psychical realism, historical realism, even possibly dialectical realism. Thank you.